I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Today, it's my pleasure to be speaking with Aubrey Anable about her book, Playing with Feelings, Video Games, and Affect. If you haven't read it, I definitely recommend it, and like all my interviewees, Aubrey has graciously provided 5 book recommendations that you should be able to see in the notes, or you can see at tinap.org. And check them out, buy them on Amazon or wherever you purchase your books. And if you get a chance to pick up and read any of the recommended books by Aubrey or the other interviewees on the show, let me know what you thought. What books you found most appealing, anything you thought, anybody you want to have interviewed who's putting out new work. Send me a private message, send me a post, tweet, whatever, messenger pigeon. I'm happy to start a conversation with anyone and everyone interested in taking part. So Aubrey, thank you again. Perhaps we could start with the question of affect. I know not everybody has read up on affect theory. Some people may have, but need a bit of a refresher. What are we talking about with affect? A-F-F-E-C-T.
Yeah, that is a really good question. Affect is one of these concepts. It's one of these words that get thrown around quite a bit in theory these days, or at least in the past 10, 15 years. And it's not an easy concept, but I'll do my best. I think a starting way of defining affect is to say it's a way of talking about feelings and emotions, and a way of talking about the body's sensorial properties and ways of sensing the world without restricting it to just emotions or feelings, kind of talking very broadly about sense perception. But it's also a way for me of talking about feelings and emotions beyond just personal subjective experiences. So importantly, I think what affect does is gets at the social properties of feeling and emotions and the political aspects of the ways in which feelings and emotions circulate through the world and across bodies and between people and their environments.
That's a great explanation. I'm sure we can talk more details about that. Perhaps easier, but maybe not. What are we talking about when we talk about video games? Title of your book, Playing with Feelings, Video Games and Affect. How are you thinking about video games? And of course, I think you talk about yourself a little bit in the book too, so maybe you can mention that.
Yeah. Well, I get this question a lot, especially in relation to, how I chose the video games to look at in my book. Academics love to ask questions about definitions, right? This is why we're doing this. Like, well, how do you define video games? And as I say in the book, it's important to me to have a really broad, kind of big tent definition of video games. And it's not just important to me, personally for my own research, but I think it's important for game studies and media studies at this moment to not get too caught up in these sort of restrictive kind of medium specificity types of arguments about what video games are and are not. So if people call it a video game, then I call it a video game. If it's interactive and, you make some choices in it and there are some images and sounds on a screen and some kind of interface, then I say it's a video game. So the reason why I think restrictive definitions of video games and debates about what video games are and are not, the reason I think that kind of discourse is troubling is because I think in gaming culture, but also in game studies, people use these definitions to make evaluations about what counts and what doesn't, and what types of players matter and what types of players don't matter. So, for example, the distinction between hardcore, big budget first-person shooters being, historically taken very seriously by game studies, while for, a long time, the field really overlooked casual games, small little puzzle games that people play on their mobile phones. And that's not simply a kind of definitional problem. It's also a political problem because it meant that game studies was overlooking women players and older women players. So these types of distinctions and how they get made were an important inspiration for why I wanted to write this book, and why I have, I think, both a pretty broad definition of what affect is and also a pretty broad definition of what video games are.
Yeah, that's perfect. Actually, it leads into the next question I wanted to ask you about, which is your choice early on. I can't remember if it's the intro or the first chapter, perhaps, where you talk about, I think it's a young woman playing Candy Crush for a second on her phone while she waits for a train or a bus to go to work.
Yeah,
which may or may not be you. I don't know if you want to answer that, but
we can talk about that.
I mean, I thought that was an interesting choice to set up the game Candy Crush, which, if anybody, I think everybody does know about this thing, but it's, it's not one of the traditionally like really serious games. In fact, it's probably the opposite. It's something that people pick up, put down. And so I'm wondering, what you were thinking about that in terms of this hierarchy, because there's definitely perhaps a lot written on, kind of famous thinking games like Myst and stuff like that.
Right.
There seems to be more acceptance for thinking about Candy Crush and these kinds of less serious games. But why did you start with that, and why is that an important thing to study today? Yeah.
Well, that description that I have in the introduction of a woman playing Candy Crush Saga on her phone while she's waiting, for a train to arrive or just on a commute. It's not autobiographical. It is a made up moment that, I say in the book I've held in my mind as something to ground the types of issues that I was interested in exploring in this book. And what I mean by that is I really wanted to think about video games as ordinary, as part of ordinary life. That can also, and it does, I think, apply to the types of games you were describing, the types of games that we understand as more cerebral or more serious, like Myst, or any of the, epic games like BioShock that take hours and hours to play, and you certainly aren't playing on your phone while waiting for a bus. The reason why I want to think about video games as ordinary and also as part of everyday life is because I think that starts to, first of all, undo some of those distinctions that I was just talking about between Candy Crush and BioShock, for example, that I think the woman waiting on a subway platform playing a game like Candy Crush is not necessarily doing something so different from what we imagine the typical hardcore gamer to be doing when he, because it typically is imagined as a man, right, escapes into the immersive and challenging world of a game like BioShock for hours at a time, possibly, right? I think they are both actually using video games to work out particular feelings about our everyday lives in particular ways. Now, that's not to say that I would collapse the difference between those games at all and say that they're the same, but this idea of video games as ordinary and as part of ordinary life was really important to my project. And I think that's also because thinking about video games as ordinary and part of everyday life contributes to undoing some kind of stereotypes about what it is we do when we play video games. Like we're just killing time, or we're just, escaping the world. And my book is really trying to kind of push back against those discourses, to actually think about how video games are intimately tied to all the other types of activities that we do through networked computers, right? I mean, just every other type of work or socializing that we do through computers in the present.
Yeah, well, and you have a nice line, something to the effect of games are not immaterial, but they're also material, and they also take place to some extent in the material world. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about how that works, because of course, I think a lot of people, maybe gamers and maybe non-gamers, think of it as outside of the real world, because maybe you're slaying dragons or maybe you're fighting futuristic robots or something. And so that doesn't exist in the real world. But your book, I think, makes an argument that to some extent it does. So I was wondering if you could talk about that.
I mean, this is where I think affect becomes important to talk about as a way of thinking about, first of all, the very material ways in which when we play a video game, our bodies are harnessed to these devices, right? The woman playing Candy Crush Saga is literally holding her phone in her hand, and her whole body kind of, takes a certain attitude in relation to this device, and her fingers are touching the screen. And that is not immaterial. These ways of experiencing the device, holding the device, touching it, matter in terms of how we understand what video games are and what they feel like to play. Just as, someone pushing buttons like crazy to kill a bunch of things in like a really intense, violent game is going to have a slightly different comportment, but it's also going to be quite visceral. It's going to be something experienced by the body. It's not simply existing in some other realm, some other fantasy world. So that's partly what I mean by, of course, video games are material, right? They're happening in real time with our bodies. But I think it's also, let's see, how do I want to get at that? It's also, affect is useful for thinking about this relationship between what we perceive as these fantasy worlds and games and our, lived experience in ordinary life, because it's an idea that allows us to think about how what we are experiencing and feeling when we're playing video games matters in the sense of the root of that word, and material, like it actually has a material form in terms of it affects our bodies, but that feelings, the kinds of experiences and feelings that we are, as I say in the book, kind of rehearsing through these games can have real material effects on the rest of our lives. The feelings that we experience when we read an absorbing novel or watch a film, we're very used to understanding how those types of feelings matter. And we don't simply say that it's a kind of escapism and that the effects of what we experience when we engage with that kind of art doesn't matter. But there's still a sense, I think, that when we understand what people are feeling and doing when they play a video game, that we just kind of dismiss it as escapism, as immaterial, as unimportant.
I mean, there's a lot we could say about that, but I'm wondering if you have a particular approach when it comes to studying a game. So if you decide that you're going to think critically about Candy Crush Saga or Kentucky Route Zero or any of the games that you look at, of course, I mean, there's a lot that you do in the book. So providing historical context, providing examples, reading beneath the surface of some of these images and stuff like that. But when you're thinking about studying a game, do you have a certain approach? Like, is there a way that you have established for yourself to think through a game, or is it different every time? I'm just curious if you could say a little bit about your approach to studying any game that you might come across.
Sure. This is also, this is a good question. It's a hard question for me because I think underneath your question is, what is your method? Like, what makes this generalizable? What you are saying about these games.
Yeah, and to a certain extent, but I'm very happy to hear a sort of a personal method as opposed to like, I don't need content analysis or critical discourse analysis. I mean, while those things are great, I'm curious on a personal level as well. Yeah.
So, as I say in the book, the types of games that I chose were closely related to just the types of games that I play. I'm not making a claim for some kind of larger objectivity here, that I'm going to, carefully select games that I think will give me the best data to support, my overall argument. That in fact, it is a highly subjective archive, right, that I have assembled in this book. I call that out because I think that's true of most game studies, but people don't necessarily always call that out, right? in order to really analyze video games, you have to be able to play them, right? And I'm not a big first-person shooter player. Like, I wouldn't even be able to finish many of those games. I don't have those skills. So that's part of what informed the types of games that I looked at. But that also informs, I think, people who are looking at first-person shooters. It's always highly subjective. I think that's what I'm saying, the types of games that people choose. Mm-hmm. My general approach beyond that, like I was interested in exploring the games that I was playing and finding interesting. But I was also, and I'm still also, quite invested in applying the types of sort of close analysis skills and training that I have as a film and media scholar to video games, because I don't think that game studies needs to reinvent a whole new discipline to study games. I think the kinds of humanist approaches that we have in film and media studies are already perfectly applicable to make sense of what is going on in a game. So close reading, textual analysis, doing a kind of cultural history of how games emerged, but specifically in each chapter really wanted to pay close attention to a specific game and to let it sort of lead where the theory went, kind of let it sort of teach me what I think is going on in the game and how I think the game kind of is addressing players emotionally. So each chapter is quite different because the types of games that I'm looking at are quite different. So I don't propose that there's sort of some kind of overarching approach that one should take to every game. I think it's quite the opposite. Like in film studies or in media studies more broadly, we pay close attention to the specificities of the objects that we're looking at and develop our theory from that.
Would you say then that there's anything different, I guess, that you might do when, say, writing a book on film and looking at various films and analyzing them, maybe even through affect theory, for example, mm-hmm. compared to games? Is there any change that you have to make, or would you say that it's basically the exact same thing you would do in terms of how you approach it, how you critically think through it?
Oh, no, I wouldn't say it's the exact same. And I didn't mean to suggest that. I just mean that the types of skills that we have as close readers apply to video games as well. So thinking about images, thinking about aesthetics, thinking about sound and movement and rhythm, these are all things that when we do close analysis of film or other media objects, we know how to do. Mm-hmm. But in film and media studies, there's this real, people are a little afraid of video games because they think it requires something entirely different. So I tend to maybe overemphasize the similarities. Like, no, we can apply these same things to video games, because I'm trying to encourage my colleagues to not treat video games as some totally separate kind of bizarre entity that they don't know how to analyze. Mm-hmm. Yes, there are differences, right? Of course there are differences. And I really try to pay attention to those differences in my book in terms of thinking, like I said, again, about embodiment and thinking about what it means to push buttons, for example, or to hold a device in our hands with a mobile phone game and touch a touch screen. That these are not just, how do I want to put it? These are not just differences that are about the kind of just highly subjective experience of the individual player. These are actual, I think, formal differences, and they should be thought of as kind of sort of formal qualities of video games. The way in which the interface is designed, and actually thinking very closely about interface design, would be, I think, one of the crucial differences between how, say, you approach a film and how you think about a video game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Are there any ideas, I guess, that you especially found useful from film theory, but not necessarily only from those kinds of theorists, in applying it to video games? Like, is there anything that you found that you kept going back to in terms of a sort of theory or the way that you're thinking about video games?
That's a good question. I'm not coming up with a good answer for that. Maybe something will come to me later.
No, sure. I'm just thinking about, so first off, is your dissertation, was it in film theory?
No. So my PhD is in visual and cultural studies.
Okay.
I mean, I can tell you sort of how I came to writing this book, because it was not based on my dissertation. So in the Visual and Cultural Studies program at the University of Rochester, it's a very interdisciplinary program, but it's one way to divide it is to say there's the kind of more art historical approaches in the program, and then there are those people who are doing more film and media studies. And I was definitely in the film and media studies track. I was interested in doing research on essentially how digital media were affecting cinema and ideas about cinema and how we define the cinematic. So really thinking about interactivity, but that kind of worked its way into a project that was about the history of how computational media became spatialized, like given these sort of spatial metaphors of the graphical user interface and things like that, through kind of discourses about the city. So I was really thinking about the 1960s and 70s, the sort of emergence of computational media, discourses of urban crisis and disorder, and using computers as a kind of imaginary tool that could control all that. My work has obviously changed quite a bit, but the connection there was that I did a lot of research on human-computer interaction and the emergence of human-computer interaction as a field in computer science, and thinking about this question that is still so much a part of my research, what it means when bodies and computers are in contact, essentially, and thinking about how interfaces are designed to imagine the body of a particular user, and then how that interaction is represented on the screen through images and sounds. And as I was doing that research, video games obviously became a really important site for how a lot of these ideas about how to design an interface were actually worked out through video games pretty early on. And I didn't know this until I started doing that research. I mean, I was born in the 1970s. I grew up with video games. But as I was doing this research, I didn't realize until I started doing it, first of all, how early game-like applications were being developed. I mean, as early as the late 1950s, and that they were being developed as a way of creatively thinking about how to explain computers to users who don't know much about them, as an application for human-computer interaction. And so that really set up where this book kind of picked up from. So I did that research sort of for my dissertation, and then moved pretty quickly on to just focusing on video games and affect theory.
And that is a really interesting aspect of the book that you mentioned, that in order to show people what scientists and often people with military contracts were doing with computers, which you can't see really because it's basically an ugly box. And so they're doing calculations ahead of time to figure stuff out, and then inside bits are sort of moving around or being replaced with one another, but you don't really see that until we get those cathode ray displays, and then later on better visuals to sort of demonstrate what's actually going on, which is why you don't really need, I mean, originally you didn't really need a monitor in a computer. You could just throw cards in there, and if you knew what was happening, great, but most people outside of that realm didn't know what was happening. But it makes me think a little, about this whole interdisciplinary thing that we have going on, and that we have had going on. Most of the writers, early writers in media studies, cultural studies, were basically English professors. And so trained in traditional ways of studying literature, and then saying, we should actually apply this to popular culture or to film or television, perhaps. But now we have those actual disciplines, right? Like you can get a degree. My master's is in popular culture. And so, you can get a film studies degree, and you can get all these other things. Game studies, though, I mean, there are, of course, some places that, I don't know, maybe they do, maybe there's a game studies master's now.
I think there are, yeah.
Yeah. But I'm curious if you think we will be moving more towards simply an interdisciplinary approach, or there is a place now that game studies has become more well developed, that there ought to be maybe a game studies department, as well as a film studies, as well as maybe a media studies, or have things gotten sort of too amorphous to put into these kinds of categories?
Yeah, that's a big question.
And you don't need to solve this for me today, but I'm curious how you feel about it.
I definitely have thoughts about this, but I also, I'll give you my opinions on it, but I don't mean them to be kind of prescriptive. So one of the things I said earlier was that it was important for me to kind of bridge the methods that we already have in film and media studies and apply them to video games, and that I don't think that game studies needs to reinvent its own, a whole new kind of approach, right? Mm-hmm. I think that is where game studies is going, that there was a kind of first wave of game scholarship that was very concerned about marking boundaries for the discipline and saying, this is what game studies is. It is not film and media studies. We're not studying narrative, and those types of boundary marking kind of debates have really subsided. Mm-hmm. And now we're in this kind of second wave of game studies scholarship that is far more open and interdisciplinary and accepting of many different types of approaches. And I think that's totally healthy. And I think that's exactly what should be happening. Whether or not game studies will get the kind of institutional kind of recognition of, say, film studies or media studies departments, and whether or not that actually should happen. First of all, I already think, game studies does have institutional recognition. There are game studies programs. There's definitely game design programs, and, mm-hmm. and there's more sort of humanist and social science approaches that are being used in some of those programs to actually study the history and aesthetics of games. And this is it's just happening, right? It's great. If game studies, programs emerge in the humanities and social sciences as in the ways that film studies programs did, maybe that will happen. I kind of think that really game studies should be done in many different departments, right? Like mm-hmm. We need all these different approaches. So I think people are studying games, and they're studying them from all sorts of different perspectives across different faculties, and that's fine. I think that's healthy. Film studies, right? Just because, there are now these programs called film studies, it doesn't actually make them necessarily solidly disciplinary, right? Film studies is still incredibly interdisciplinary. I'm in a film studies program, and every single one of my colleagues does something pretty radically different in terms of their approaches and their methods, right? So mm-hmm. I guess how these things develop, they tend to be a little messy and uneven. And I think that's fine, actually. I think that's just how it's always been. And I think that's what will also happen with game studies.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, it's interesting to see the, in some ways, push for game studies as a very distinct conference series, for example, or a set of scholars and stuff like that. But then when you actually look at what people are doing, a lot of them are in film studies or cultural studies or English programs or what have you. Mm-hmm. And it seems like some ways there's this call for specialization, like meetings or conferences are coming out and they're very sort of niche. But then at the same time, there's a lot of calls for more general things, and it seems like sort of arts and humanities might eventually sort of collapse back into just one thing where there's game studies, cinema, TV, media studies, all these kinds of things, but under a sort of umbrella because the specialization doesn't necessarily fit anymore. But I mean, that's a whole big thing that I guess we just have to sort of wait and see what happens.
Well, I'll tell you this. I mean, when I advise graduate students who want to work on video games, I always tell them that they need to be careful about making their research too niche, right? Should not become too enamored with game studies as a discipline, right? And because there is this tendency, as you're pointing out, in game studies to have these kind of niche, we'll have our own conferences, we'll have our own journals, all of that. And I think especially for a graduate student who's coming up and wanting to get a job, I think it's important that their work be able to speak very broadly to whatever discipline they're also aligned with. So whether it's, someone in an English department who's working on video games and narrative forms or something like that, then their mm-hmm. work, even though it's about video games, it needs to also be legible to the field of literary studies. And I think that's not just a kind of practical kind of advice that I'm giving to graduate students about just how hard it is to get a job these days, but it's also, I think, the types of questions and issues that those of us who are doing research on video games, the types of questions and issues that we're exploring and asking are questions that should be interesting to people who don't necessarily think about video games or even care about video games. So I'm intensely interested in digital aesthetics, or actually just kind of aesthetics broadly. And the types of questions that I ask, I happen to ask them through video games. But I think that my questions should be interesting to other people who are also interested in aesthetics, digital or otherwise.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point. I remember a lot of the things that I've been more willing to look into in recent years, like comics or video games, especially like in early years of graduate school, I understood that to be like a very niche thing, and you needed to be like a super gamer in order to study video games. And if not, like it was a very sort of closed off thing, or at least that was the impression I got.
Yeah.
And really, yeah, I think if you're asking questions about the human condition, for example, or art and aesthetics, then yeah, it needs to some extent speak to other people while maintaining a sort of nuanced approach or a close reading, but also something that ought to answer questions beyond just a very, very niche group, which I think, yeah, is great advice, especially if you're entering the field and trying to look for a job.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. You sort of mentioned how, in some sense, this work that you're doing is quite subjective and you're thinking about how you fit within this environment. But at the same time, of course, it needs to apply to bigger questions than just your own personal experience. Affect, as you said, is relating to feelings and how we sort of share feelings on a social level, but also experience them ourselves. If you're playing a game and you're feeling sad or happy or perplexed, or whatever the case is, how much, when you're thinking about this or writing about this, do you think about how you're literally feeling? And how much do you think about, I guess, other situations? Like, where do you fall in when you're thinking about affect and the experience of gaming?
I mean, I'll use an example from a chapter in my book where I talk about the feelings of failure that we can feel sometimes or often when we play video games. Like failure meaning the feelings of sort of disappointment, frustration, anger sometimes when we are trying to do something in a game and we are unable to succeed, right? Mm-hmm. We keep trying to meet some objective. We keep trying to, jump from one platform to another, but not quite getting the timing right. And we keep dying, right? And this is a pretty core feature of video games, a core feature of how they're designed, because many are designed to kind of put us through our paces in the beginning, right? Like they're not meant to be easy, and we're meant to experience failure repeatedly. And then the conventional logic of video games is that through repetition, we will master that skill and we will stop failing quite as much, right? Mm-hmm. And we'll stop feeling those feelings of frustration, anger. And for me, like if a game is so difficult that I'm stuck on one particular level, can't get past one particular obstacle, then that feeling becomes something like boredom too. Like I lose interest. I just want to give up. So when I think about those feelings, my own personal subjective feelings, with something like failure in a game, I recognize that this is not just a purely subjective feeling. This is how this game has been designed, right? Mm-hmm. These feelings that are being evoked are part of the design of the game. It's not just a personal experience that I'm having. It is partly a personal experience, but it's already in the moment of me pushing those buttons and failing, part of something bigger. So we could say it's part of the something bigger of how that game was designed. It opens us up onto the scene of this is a created object, and there were people who created these challenges and difficulties, and there were the play testers who, figured out if it was too difficult and people were just going to give up. It opens us up onto that scene, right? And we can actually think about the give and take between how games are designed to elicit certain feelings, and the feelings that we're experiencing, therefore, are not purely subjective. They're part of a designed system. Mm-hmm. But then it also opens us up onto a larger social and political frame. And that's what I do in that chapter for thinking about how we experience feelings around failure more broadly in society, specifically in late capitalist conditions where failure is such a crucial part of how the systems of capitalism have been designed. That's the type of kind of movement that I do, the sort of back and forth between what is maybe first experienced as subjective, like, oh, this is frustrating, that I can't get past this point in this game, to thinking about how this is designed on the level of the game, but also how it speaks to larger social and cultural and political conditions.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a great aspect of the book, of course, the way in which you move from those areas to one another. Maybe you could say a little bit more about the political situation or the relation of gaming to, the socioeconomic status of, individuals, but also in particular groups in late capitalism. When you're looking at that, are you reading a game as a sort of symptom of the current capitalist system, or are you looking for sort of links? How do you tie in this huge idea of sort of like the political economy of the world with a seemingly insignificant game like Candy Crush or something?
Yeah, lots of people in game studies, right, have made these connections. It's very difficult to not connect video games to broader economic and political conditions. First of all, video games are a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? And a game like Candy Crush, it makes, I don't even know what the most recent statistics are, but it makes millions of dollars a year through actually getting people to pay little bits of money in order to, get past actual difficulties, to get past those feelings of failure, right? Like when they're stuck on a level and they just don't want to deal with it anymore, there's ways you can buy yourself out of that, right? Mm-hmm. So I think about the ways that games quite literally are tied in to economies and how those types of transactions and relationships between maybe a specific video game and how they operate within a larger kind of gaming industry and economy. Like, those questions are important to me, but they're also questions that are being pursued and very brilliantly answered by lots of game scholars. In this book was more interested when you go down that path, right? It's pretty easy to then say, well, video games are then just symptoms of capitalism, right? They're just these, they're actually simply reinforcing the most destructive aspects even maybe of capitalism, right? And people have made those arguments. In this book, rather than that, I'm not saying that that's not true in some ways, but like any form of popular culture, there's also something more complicated going on, right? That is about pleasure and desire and other types of feelings and fantasies that get played out and sort of motivated by and through these systems. It can also be intensely relaxing to play Candy Crush Saga. Mm-hmm. And I was interested in those types of feelings as well, right? Like, we can't dismiss the woman on the platform playing Candy Crush Saga as simply a dupe of capitalism, that we also have to think about how those little breaks that she's taking in her life are also meaningful and are allowing her, actually giving her a little momentary ludic sort of interlude that is differently structured and feels different than the rest of her working life, right? And the rest of the ways in which she engages with capitalist systems or digital systems or whatever system you want to kind of compare the game to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it reminds me, though, of a related question, which is sort of, if you think about McLuhan and the medium as the message and a lot of media studies, but also, I guess, sort of Marxist-inspired work where, especially if you start thinking about, the base and the superstructure, and therefore, we need to get back to capitalism because all of these other things are relatively insignificant. Content is relatively insignificant because it's the medium that matters. All of these things, I guess, they can be interpreted as sort of vulgar takes on the original theories. But I mean, some theories or some work, rightly or wrongly, will focus simply on the platform or how television works or how film works or how video games work, regardless of the individual games or shows or films.
Right.
And as you say in the book, the actual medium is important, right? Like if you're pressing a bunch of buttons or if you're swiping to shoot birds at pigs and stuff like that.
Right.
The game, the fact that it's a game and the fact that it is played on a cell phone or on a PlayStation matters. But also, I guess, the content matters.
Yeah.
Because I think people are going to feel more emotional about The Last of Us, actually. Have you played that? Have you seen that?
I have, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, whenever I talk to anyone about like emotional connections to games, that's
Yes.
usually the one that comes up the most. The Last of Us.
Yeah.
People feel very emotionally connected to that game, but they don't necessarily feel emotionally connected to other games that may have similar sort of first-person setups. So anyway, that is to say, how do you negotiate between the individual content of a game and the medium itself, like touchscreen games or PlayStation games or what have you? Is there a way that you found more helpful to go back and forth without maybe emphasizing only the system or only the individual content of the game? Or maybe you don't think it should be equal and you do place more emphasis on one or the other. How do you negotiate between those?
Yeah, again, it kind of depends on the game, and it depends on what type of analysis I find sort of emerging from my playing of it, right? So you said, of course, it's important to think about not just the content, but to think about the medium, right? To think about, well, these are games, but it's also important to think about the context, right? So sometimes when I was thinking about these games, I was thinking about, well, where are they played? When in the day do they tend to be played? And with something like Candy Crush Saga, that's why I have that whole description of the woman on the platform. It is a game, like so many games on our phones, that tend to be played in these small little moments between other activities. I pay attention in that game, in that chapter, right, to the actual aesthetics of the game, to actually what's going on in terms of graphics and the interface and the fact of the touch screen and the feeling of the phone in the hand. But I also pay a lot of attention to the context of where games like that are played. And that is how, my analysis emerged, right? And so with each game, my emphasis is slightly different. With some games, I focus more on what's going on in terms of representation and narrative and graphics and sound. And in other games, those types of things can fall away a bit because there might be something else going on at the level of the actual hardware, that's more interesting, that I think that we need to pay attention to. Again, I think we need to take games seriously on their own terms, kind of start from the game, the specific game, and think about each game as a potentially expressive form, something that is expressing something more than just a particular narrow idea of what the story is or what the characters are, but something that is expressing a larger idea that we can learn from about how this game kind of fits into larger systems.
I think that's helpful advice for anyone thinking about even exploring that kind of criticism or the kind of academic work that the book models. Do you have questions for the future that you hope to pursue? Like, are you going to perhaps continue thinking about video games and affect, or do you feel like maybe this book has sort of completed that chapter of your research and you're moving on? What does the future hold for you?
That is a good question as well.
No pressure, of course,
Yeah.
but I'm sure you have more questions that you hope to pursue.
I do. And I think the questions that I'm pursuing right now in my research they definitely are related to video games and affect and to the things that I look at in this book. I'm continuing to think about interfaces. So this has been, like I said, a kind of backbone of my research for a long time. In the work that I'm doing now, I'm interested in thinking about both the kind of material kind of qualities of interfaces, actual interfaces, the things that we use to input information into digital systems, but also kind of, interfaces as they're graphically designed on screens, but also thinking about interface as a kind of philosophical concept, right? As this liminal space where different types of systems communicate, like the interface as the proxy system that allows two other systems to communicate. So whether that's the system of user and software program, or something more ephemeral like cultural systems and the user's own personal beliefs, or thinking about the body as a particular type of interface that is connected to digital systems. The types of objects that I'm exploring this through are actual sort of applications of virtual reality for gaming and for cinema, because so much of the discourse around virtual reality is actually about getting rid of the interface, that's the dream of virtual reality, that it just sort of like plops you down in the midst of an immersive thing that we're supposed to not even notice the ways in which, an interface system has been designed to allow us to interact. Of course, we're not there yet, but I'm interested in that discourse, and I'm interested in kind of disrupting that a bit, but also thinking about kind of the issues of queer entanglement that I discuss in the book, and thinking that those kind of questions out more concretely and more thoroughly in this next project.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, I'm thinking with this in particular, this book, I think what it sort of points to is the fact that if you think you're playing an insignificant game, if you think feelings, for example, which I think for a long time, up until, as you said, maybe the last decade, have been effectively insignificant in critical studies, that's probably even more dangerous, because things are happening that we think are not serious or that we think are not even worth considering. And the interface is definitely one of those things where if it's working, you don't see it.
Right.
But that may be sort of more dangerous on a social level. So no, I look forward to seeing more of your work. And Aubrey, I really appreciate you spending the time talking to me today.
Oh, thank you, Chris. I really appreciate your thoughtful questions, and it was a pleasure talking to you.
As always, I really want to thank interviewees that have graciously given their time and thoughts and feelings in some cases when they didn't have to. I mean, I know this is a podcast. It's not going to count towards a tenure clock, probably, and it's not going to necessarily be rewarded in the same way that an article or a conference presentation would. And yet, I've had some really incredible guests, such as Aubrey and others, who are willing to give their time so that we can think through their work. I'm always amazed when I get to talk to people like that. Also, of course, I want to thank listeners for tuning in on whatever devices they use, and listening and commenting, and in some cases buying stickers and purchasing books from the website. It always helps, and it keeps the show going. So thanks for doing that. Until next time, cheers.